In this lecture, we'll talk about markets, understanding changes that we observe in markets and industries, and the two fundamental drivers of that, supply and demand. Anytime we talk about a market, we need to define it. And a definition of a market includes three components: a product component, a time component, and a geographic dimension. So we need to define a market before we can actually start using supply and demand analysis. We're going to talk about market demand, which describes buyer behavior, and market supply, which describes the behavior of the sellers in the marketplace. The behavior of buyers and sellers in the marketplace, especially a competitive marketplace, will give us some insights into the price changes and other changes that we observe in those markets. We're going to see that if a price changes, then we will illustrate that by a movement along an existing curve, an existing demand curve or an existing supply curve. We're going to refer to those changes as changes in the quantity demanded or changes in the quantity supplied. If some factor other than price changes, maybe the income of the individuals in our model, then we will say that demand changes. And from a demand perspective, we will illustrate that with a shift in the entire demand curve. So anytime you've got a change going on, one fundamental and useful question that you can ask yourself is the following: is this the result of a change in the price or a change in some other factor other than price? We'll also talk about supply curves. Supply curves, as I mentioned, describe the behavior of the sellers in the marketplace, and they tell you how much will be sold of a given product at a given price. We'll also see that the intersection of supply and demand gives us a market equilibrium. A market equilibrium is defined as the price at which the quantity supplied equals the quantity demanded. If the price is above the equilibrium price, we'll see that there are too many sellers and there will be an excess of the product, forcing the price down, and vice versa for situations where the price is below the equilibrium price. So let's get started now defining the characteristics of a market. Every industry or market has a time, a product, and a geographic dimension. Let's take, for example, the product, the annual or yearly market for portable power generators in the United States. Time dimension is annual, the product dimension is portable generators, and the geography or geographic component is the United States. Anytime we're analyzing a market, we need to first define it, and then we can begin exploring the behavior of the buyers and the sellers. We're going to see that a shift in the demand curve is different from a movement along the demand curve. A movement along the demand curve describes a change or an increase or decrease in the quantity demanded in response to a change in the price. In contrast, a movement of the entire demand curve corresponds to or illustrates a change in the quantity demand, a change in the demand or the number of units purchased at any given price, and will be illustrated with a shift in the demand curve. So what might cause a shift in the demand curve? Well, uncontrollable factors that affect demand out of the company's control. For instance, the weather that affects its suppliers or the price of its goods, the income of its customers, interest rates in the economy, the price of a substitute product that consumers might switch to depending on the price of the primary company's product. All of these are factors that are beyond the direct control of a particular company. All of these would be examples of factors that, if they shifted, would cause a shift in the demand curve. So the key factors that affect the shift or a change in demand, shift of the curve, would be factors outside of the company's direct control. What are some examples of controllable factors? Well, some controllable factors that are within the firm's control would include, for instance, price, advertising, the warranties offered on a particular product, the quality of the product, and a number of other components. Some of these controllable factors will affect demand, but they can be controlled by the company. Other than price, all of these factors will be illustrated with a shift in the demand curve. However, a movement or a change rather in the price of the product we will illustrate with a movement along the demand curve. So let's take some numbers and make this concrete. This is what's known as a demand schedule. This table captures some information on buyers and buyer behavior. And in particular, let's consider a market with 9 buyers, 9 individuals willing to pay somewhere between $4 and $12 for a particular product. This demand schedule shows us that at a price of $12, one individual would be willing to buy the product. At a price of $11, two individuals would be willing to buy, and so on. Whereas if a price all the way down at $4, all 9 of the individuals would be willing and interested in buying this particular product. The number or the numerical representation of this buyer behavior is what's known as a demand schedule. We can graph those data points on a curve, and that's what's known as a demand curve. So when we graph a demand schedule, it's known as a demand curve. Here we can see that we have a downward sloping curve. The price of the item is on the vertical axis and runs anywhere from $12 down to $4. The quantity or number of units demanded is illustrated on the horizontal or x-axis, and that goes anywhere from one product, we can see, at a price of $12 all the way down to, or all the way up to rather, a total of 9 units when the price is at $4. So demand curves, demand schedules are interchangeable. The curve is based upon the numbers in the underlying demand schedule, but we'll oftentimes find that it's most useful and convenient to illustrate or examine market changes using demand curves, and so our focus is going to be on that. Always keep in mind the numbers are there underlying and supporting the demand curve. Okay, now let's suppose in our example that some uncontrollable factor increases the demand for this particular product. Maybe it's an increase in the price of a substitute product. Coke and Pepsi are two good examples of substitute products. If the price of Pepsi goes up, say, consumers may switch to buying more Coke at any given price point. So let's suppose that an increase in the price of a substitute product causes a shift in the demand for the product that we're looking at, the product in question. We've got a new demand schedule, and let's suppose that at every price point, at $12, $11, $10, $5, $4, at every price point, the number of units demanded goes up by 4. So instead of 1 unit being demanded at a price of 12, now 5 units are demanded. Instead of 2 units being demanded at a price of 11, now 6 units are demanded, and so on. What does this look like? What this looks like is a shift to the right of our demand curve. The original demand curve is illustrated here in orange. The new demand curve is illustrated in black. For instance, at any given price, more quantity is demanded. If we look at the $8 price point, for example, now we have 9 units demanded versus the 5 units originally demanded. We've had a rightward shift or a vertical shift of this particular demand curve. We would refer to this as an increase in demand because some factor other than price, in this case it was the price of a competitor's product, some factor other than the price of the primary product changed, and that induced a change in consumer behavior. Again, we can look at or infer numbers or information about the underlying demand schedule. In this case, for example, that at a price of $8, the new demand curve illustrates 9 units of this item are demanded. We can infer that information directly from the graph. Supply curves describe the behavior of sellers in a particular market, and they relate the price of the product to the quantity that sellers are willing to supply at that given price. Supply curves will slope upwards and again describe the behavior of the seller. They tell us how much is going to be sold at a particular price. Like demand curves, supply curves have an underlying set of data that support them, in this case, a supply schedule. Suppose, in this example, that we have 9 sellers in the market that we're considering, just like we had 9 buyers a moment ago. We have 9 sellers willing to sell their product for between $4 and $12. Here, however, if we look at the demand schedule, and intuitively this makes sense, lower prices will induce fewer sellers into the market. So at a price of $4, we have only 1 seller who's willing to enter the market. As prices go up to 5, we have 2 sellers willing to participate in the market. Price of 6 brings an additional seller in for a total of 3, and so on. It's not until the price rises to $12 that all 9 of our suppliers are willing to enter the market and supply their product. Now, when we graph a supply schedule, it's a supply curve. This supply curve slopes upward and again reflects or captures the idea that as prices rise, more sellers will be induced to enter the market. A market equilibrium is defined as the price at which the quantity supplied equals the quantity demanded. At the equilibrium price, there's no price pressure. There's no pressure to change price for the given quantity demanded or quantity supplied, because at the equilibrium price, both are equal. The idea of equilibrium comes from the notion of a stable or balancing point. The price has conveyed or communicated the value of the buyers and the value of the sellers and adjusted to that point where the quantity demanded by buyers exactly matches or equals the quantity supplied by sellers. Here we can see an illustration of the equilibrium, which can be found simply by intersecting the supply and the demand curves for a particular product. In a competitive equilibrium, there are no unconsummated wealth-creating transactions. For every buyer, there's a seller, and in this case, we can see that the equilibrium price is $8 and the equilibrium quantity is 5. Any price above $8 would result in an excess of supply, more suppliers than buyers. Any price below $8 would result in an excess of demand or a shortage of the product, more buyers than sellers. If we line up the demand schedule and the supply schedule, we can also see that at the price of $8, the quantity demanded and the quantity supplied are equal. So we can identify the market equilibrium price one of two ways: by looking at a curve or a graph of the supply and the demand curves and looking for that point of intersection, or by looking at the demand and supply schedules and identifying the price point at which the quantity supplied equals the quantity demanded. In this lecture, we've talked about the characteristics of a market and the characteristics of buyer behavior and seller behavior. The demand curve is the fundamental tool we use to model buyer behavior, and the supply curve is the fundamental tool that we use to model supplier behavior. When we intersect the two, we can find the price that it would obtain in a competitive equilibrium. Thanks for listening.